everybody.
Good
Nice to see you all. And let me jump in, and I'll ask in a little while about the Democratic National Convention and what you all thought. I do want to speak about that today. But before I do that, you may recollect that we were in the middle of a discussion of the policy proposals that I believe are attainable, although a stretch for American politics in the current period. That is to say, equality restoring proposals. I'm hesitating. There we go. I was not seeing the PowerPoint.
Can you see it now?
A little bit more to the left. Okay, now I can.
State of national. Now, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Something that says the state of national elections at the conclusion of the Democratic nominating convention?
No.
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 End of inequality.
You are seeing inequality. Good. That's what you're supposed to be seeing. So let me see if I can get where you are. Something strange is happening here, but I think I can fix this. Let's see.
What it is not exactly clear.
What it is not exactly clear. Let me get down to where I wanted to take you. And this is where we were. Talking about tax reform and talking about ideas guiding it and then proposals for it. And I just very briefly hope that this is coming back to you. My discussion last week was focused on the idea that the United States requires systematic reform and that the kind of reform that it requires is reform that restores the progressivity of our tax code, that is used to break up large concentrations of income and wealth because they tend to both damage democracy and stifle economic competition and create self-perpetuating stratification, caste, privilege, right? And that in order to do this, we probably require multiple tax tools, making our income tax more progressive, increasing the revenue for Social Security and Medicare taxation and payroll taxation, as one of you pointed out to me, increasing corporate taxation and earnings taxation, as another of you pointed out to me. But I think we also need to consider forms of taxation that have not been implemented in this country. And that includes a nationwide sales tax or a value-added tax, and most importantly, a wealth tax, right? And so this is the first item on the heavy lift agenda for restoring equality in the United States, or at least diminishing the incredibly damaging inequality that has opened up over the last 50 years. And so that's where we left off. And I now want to talk with you about a number of other measures. And to be clear, later in this lecture, I will talk with you about the idea of the Democrats coming to power and staying in power for quite a while. This would require the kind of democratic control over the federal legislature that was exercised in the 1930s under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, or in the middle 1960s under Lyndon Baines Johnson and the Great Society, right? The idea here is that we may be ready for not only another period of democratic resurgence, democratic with a capital D in that context, but also highly ambitious legislating, right, of a kind that the Democrats really have not tried or tried very intermittently in the years since the middle of the 1960s. So what else would be on that agenda? And I am not going to go into detail on many of these matters because there's other stuff for us to talk about. But it seems to me reparations for racial subordination of African Americans has to be high up this list. We are in the middle of a national reckoning about racial injustice in American society. The most obvious, the most visible, the most dramatic aspect of this is police violence against African Americans, where we now have an extensive digital archive documenting this, most heartbreakingly in the case of George Floyd. But it doesn't stop there. Obviously, there are now hundreds of videos documenting police violence and brutality against African Americans. That's the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg that then extends deeper to the racial asymmetries of our criminal justice system, which don't just have to do with the police, but have to do with prosecution, have to do with jury decision-making, have to do with sentencing by judges, have to do with jail time served and jail conditions, have to do still more broadly with what it does to the African American community in the United States to be the victims of mass incarceration. And that gets us still more deeply to the fact that the United States has a stubborn wealth gap of 7 to 10 to 1. Right, and then to be clear, right, 7 to 1 to 10 to 1. That the average white family, depending upon the year in which you do your data collection, has 7 times as much wealth to 10 times as much wealth as the average African American family. And ultimately, I do not believe there is any explanation for this other than racism and its legacy and its ongoing effects. And so one of the things that the current moment presents as an opportunity is, as Joe Biden said in his acceptance speech, to remove the stain of racism from the national character. But to do that requires not just criminal justice reform, certainly not merely police reform. It requires something more dramatic. And I won't go into today what reparations might mean, but I do think it has to focus on wealth creation for African Americans. All right, just to be clear, African Americans are not the only people who are suffering. Far from it. As I spent a fair bit of time in this class arguing, it's white working class Americans as well. It's everybody in the bottom 50% of the economic distribution in our society. Arguably, it's everybody who's not in the top 20% who've seen downward mobility, and especially the bottom 50% have seen increased economic vulnerability and precariousness, and the attendant damage to social standing and self-worth that that brings. And so one of the things I suggested in my list of stage 1 reforms, right, the stuff that would be, I'm sorry, I won't go back to it. I was going to go back to it, but I'll just refresh your memory. Stage 1 reforms was a jobs creation program, perhaps a Green New Deal. And that is, I would suggest, something that we need immediately and in response to the damage the coronavirus is doing to our economy. And please note, in certain respects, it appears that that damage is getting worse, not better at present, and may continue to get worse until the federal government manages to pass more stimulus legislation, more legislation that protects average workers and the unemployed. Now, going back then to the stage 2 reforms, the stuff that we can't do immediately and as a response to what the coronavirus is doing to us, but have to do in terms of long-term equality promoting legislation. There's a whole literature on what is being called an economy without work. And that label is exaggerated and stylized. Obviously, there's still work in the American economy and the world economy, but the assumption guiding legislation around income, social contribution, social standing for almost the entirety of the 20th century, certainly from the New Deal forward, has been that the object of social legislation should ultimately be to get everyone a good job, and that the economy was robust and powerful enough to create good jobs for everyone. And this literature on an economy without jobs is suggesting that that assumption no longer applies in the 21st century. As we move from the beginning to the middle of the 21st century, we are seeing that the long-term trends in globalization, automation, wealth creation, all suggest that a robust, well-functioning economy does not need everyone working. And the sense of desperation that gives rise to the increasing suicides, alcoholism, drug addiction and overdose in the white working class, I think is a premonition, a sense, an intuition of disposability. And I'm sorry for the neologism, but the idea here is that you are no longer necessary, that you are disposable, that the economy does just fine without your work and your labor. And if our model of social inclusion is through paid labor, then more and more people are going to be made to feel socially disposable in addition to suffering from economic precariousness. And in this sense, I think Andrew Yang and others who advocate for this are absolutely right. We need some form of social income. I call it decommodified. Again, sorry for the jargon, but the basic idea here is that your social income should not depend exclusively on your capacity to attract paid labor, right? We certainly will want to continue to incentivize people to work, to give them higher incomes if they land good jobs. But we also need to recognize that not everybody is going to be able to do that. And we need to remove the stigma from receiving social support if the economy does not generate sufficient jobs to allow everyone to be employed and to sustain themselves through employment. We need to recognize that women who raise and care for children, who care for their elders and their loved ones when they are sick or infirm, are doing meaningful social labor. That other people in our society find ways of contributing through activism, through artistic contributions, through efforts that sustain communities or environments or build neighborhoods, and to perhaps require forms of social service, whether they're care for loved ones or benefits for neighborhoods, but not necessarily wage labor anymore as a condition of receiving social income. And so again, major, ambitious. In a sense, it depends on not just passing the legislation, but transforming the culture so that, quote, being on the dole is not the only image of when one receives social support, that one receives social support not only in the exceptional circumstances when one is unemployed, preferably and presumably temporarily, but in fact as a basic reward for being a contributing member of society, even when the form of contribution is not necessarily paid labor. All right, fourth big idea here, genuine fair equality of opportunity. And again, this is looking at the stuff I showed you 2 weeks ago on opportunity markets and the idea that essentially if you're not spending $8,000 a year per child on concerted cultivation, enriching that child, in addition to everything else you're spending on sending them to school and affording the neighborhood that has the good school district, if you're not doing that, there's a very low likelihood that your child is going to go to a good school in the United States today. That is not equality of opportunity by any stretch. And one of the things we are, I think, increasingly aware of is the unequal funding of education. And so there are vast disparities in the quality of instruction, in the teacher to student ratio, in the physical facilities present in the school, in the enrichment opportunities made available to the children in the school, depending upon the tax base. And the evolution of American society from the 1950s to the present has been one of fragmentation and economic segregation in order, right? It's not a byproduct. It's a direct aim of much of this, in order to preserve and create unequal funding for schools, in order to be able to hoard opportunities for the children of the already privileged. And I think, again, we need a systematic rethinking of how education is funded and structured, how admissions to higher education operates. We are not America. We are not the land of opportunity. We will not and cannot be unless and until we do something about equality of opportunity in our society. A substantial and important first step in that regard is equalizing funding for schools on a per pupil basis. Even better would be breaking down the highly fragmentary nature of school zoning and allowing the children of rich and poor people to go to school with each other from a young age forward. This would transform education, transform opportunity, but also transform our society as a whole, produce greater mutual understanding and solidarity. It seems to me this is yet another of these extremely important, extremely ambitious, difficult policies that is required if we are going to have a robust, cooperative, equality promoting suite of legislation. Pro-union policies, I think this is very straightforward. Unions were extremely important to leveling the playing field in labor negotiations and labor policies. And we've seen that the labor force participation in America has gone down by more than 50%. I'm sorry, the unionized labor force has gone down by more than 50% over the last 60 years. We need to reverse that trend. The only way to reverse that trend is through legislation. Societies like Canada and Germany that have passed pro-union legislation or maintained pro-union legislation have maintained much higher levels of unionization and much higher wages for their workers. The next item is another item inspired by other advanced industrial societies, and their corporate law requires a different composition of corporate governing boards than we have in the United States. In particular, they use a stakeholder as opposed to a shareholder model of corporate governance. And what that means in practice is that they require rough equality of representation, but for, on the one hand, the people who own shares of the corporation, that's what we have in the United States, but also for the workers and the consumers, right? And so what European, German, Austrian, etc. corporate law says is that those who govern a corporation should be those who are affected by the most important decisions that corporation makes, and that isn't only the owners. We've had a near exclusive attention to short-term profitability in corporate governance, and this has hurt workers, it's hurt the long-term interests of corporations themselves. And so we need to change the structure of governance in corporations. This is frankly a relatively straightforward technical fix. It doesn't require a vast change in culture or a vast transformation of the economy. Yet it is going to take concerted political will, because you can bet that the lobbyists will be aggressively trying to prevent this kind of legislation from being passed. Justice in compensation. This might not even be appropriately in stage 2. This might be low-hanging fruit if Democrats regain control of the presidency and the Senate. Basically, this means raising the minimum wage, but I would argue that for the long term, what is required is a more nuanced approach to minimum wage legislation of the kind reflected in living wage legislation, which says if there is a basket of goods that every person in a region, the San Francisco Bay Area, requires in order to sustain a decent minimum standard of living. They require housing, they require healthcare, they require transportation, they require food, they require a certain number of additional items like clothing. How much does that cost? And what it costs in the San Francisco Bay Area is different from what it costs in Texas or North Dakota or Iowa. Give workers the ability to earn with a single full-time job what they require to sustain themselves and their families. Set the minimum wage as a living wage and not simply as an arbitrary figure, not in any way connected to the actual cost of living. All right, let's get into some of the most ambitious ideas now. One of them is campaign finance and lobbying reform. And here the basic idea is that in order to pass this kind of ambitious legislative agenda, in order to prevent those accumulations of wealth that do occur from being translated into concentrations of political power that allow the wealthy to shape the legislative agenda, we need to limit the capacity of the very wealthy to finance the American electoral system. I've shown you data on this, that right now, the vast majority, and it's beyond majority, the super majority, 90 percent of the funding of American politics comes exclusively from the very wealthy once we take political action committees and dark money into account. If we only take the funding of the parties and candidates into account, it's still the case that less than 1% of the population provides more than 50% of the funding, right? There's no way that we can have equal representation, equally valuable votes, equal opportunity to influence political discourse in a society where almost all of the funding for the political process, and especially for elections, come from a very tiny sliver of the population. And so some of this requires the Supreme Court to have a different composition, to change its tune on the equation between speech and spending and corporations and persons. But frankly, I believe much of this could be done in the short term with some effect by ordinary legislation, legislation that encourages and amplifies spending and giving by private individuals at small levels, that generates greater visibility and accountability for lobbying efforts. Again, without going into the details, this has to be on the list of equality promoting legislation. Two more ideas. Aggressive enforcement of antitrust and beefed up banking regulation. And the idea here is relatively simple. We've got too much concentration of economic power in our economy. We have some laws on the books that would already address this, but those laws are not being enforced aggressively. So we need to change the way in which the law is enforced. And we may need new 21st century antitrust or anti-concentration legislation as well. A company like Google may not sell very much, but its power to shape the economy, to shape our culture, to shape, frankly, increasingly, the way in which we think and the information available to us is formidable. And it's exactly that kind of concentration of power that antitrust legislation was originally designed to counter. We need 21st century antitrust legislation. And finally, I think we are increasingly aware of the degree of interconnection in our economy, right? When you can't get toilet paper at the grocery store because global supply chains have broken down, not just because people are hoarding it, that's part of it, but the reason they're hoarding it has a lot to do with the fact that there's not enough of it. The supply has fallen apart, and that's just one of hundreds of examples, some of them less funny, to do with the supply of personal protection equipment for nurses and doctors in hospitals. We are in an integrated, interconnected, globalized economy, and frankly, not only are the workers in the less developed parts of the world the beneficiaries of this, we are all the beneficiaries of it as well, in terms of the cost of the goods that we purchase, in terms of the overall wealth generation in our economy. We obviously have to change the distribution of that wealth to make it more equal, and that's what everything in this list above is about. I think we frankly should be less focused on wealth creation and more focused on distribution, given how wealthy we are already and the evidence I presented you that getting wealthier is no longer contributing to our happiness or well-being or health. But having said all of that, I don't think that the path to greater equality needs to go through the highly destructive channel of disintegrating the global economy, scaling back on the degree of globalization. As opposed to that, what we need is trade agreements that are, as I put it, equality promoting, and that have, among other things, social tariffs built into them. Our tariffs should not be primarily economic at this point. I don't believe that the trade war that Donald Trump launched with China was well thought out or good legislation or good policy, but I do believe that we need to be asking our trading partners to, among other things, enforce good environmental legislation, allow for unionization, not have systematic human rights abuses, have decent minimum wage legislation. And that if they fail to do those things, then the United States allowing their goods to enter our markets without some penalty is a form of unilateral disarmament, is forcing our workers to compete against corporations that are destroying the environment and workers who are being unfairly and unjustly exploited. And so there are the right kind of trade agreements that do allow for intelligent globalization without producing terrible effects for American workers or the global economy. That's it. That's what I believe we need to be doing here and now. And obviously, this is a wish list. This is a fantasy. But I also want to suggest to you that at the start of the New Deal was a wish list. It was a fantasy. That at the beginning of the Great Society, that too was not necessarily a realistic legislative agenda. It was ambitious, yet through hard work, through mobilization, protest, support, unionization, party activism, we have been able to do this before. We need to do it for the sake of our democracy. We need to do it for the sake of our fidelity to the American dream, for decency in American society. I will stop there. As I say, there's other stuff I want to cover today, but before I do that, I want to hear from you, questions, comments, thoughts. And so get ready. I'm going to unmute everyone. Please feel free to participate. Who wants to start us out?
Well, David, I will start out. This is Matt Mitchell.
Hi, Matt.
Are you familiar with a guy that writes for the for Foreign Affairs, for the January-February 2020 issue, article called The Neo-Socialist Delusion? And
go ahead.
He would take you on. This is a professor at Catholic University of America, and I think he ignores the social aspects of unbridled capitalism, but he makes some interesting points, one of which is that if the wealthy are getting much wealthier, the less wealthy are getting wealthier too, that the alternative may not be as satisfactory. He says the intellectual heirs of Adam Smith, as opposed to those of Rousseau, are interested less in capping inequality than in raising the standard of living for the population at large, finally achieving that universal opulence that Smith so presciently predicted free markets could deliver. So there's another view on this.
So that's Jerry Muller, is that right?
Right.
Yeah, and so I'm familiar with the argument. And I would counter with Wilkinson and Pickett in the spirit level, right? The idea that everyone is improved by a growing economy seems just no longer to be supported by good social scientific research. So if you look at what Adam Smith was the context in which he was writing, right? In which he was describing universal opulence, you're talking about a society that still had regular famine, in which people regularly died of starvation, in which the average European peasant owned one or two articles of clothing, right, by category, one or two shirts, one or two pair of pants, one or two pair of shoes, right? And that was it. Right, so I guess I think we've already surpassed by far what Smith would refer to as universal opulence. He is absolutely right that the poor are better off today in absolute terms compared with where they were 50 years ago. That's a benefit of the economy. But he's absolutely wrong if he believes, as he does, that the poor feel like they are better off today than they were 50 years ago. And I showed you data on relative inequality 50 years ago, right? Where if you compared the top 20% and the bottom 20%, they were that far away, right? And if you compare them today, they're that far away. And what we know about human psychology and human sociology is people don't care as much about being a little bit better off today than they were 50 years ago, right? So we got a little bit better off at the bottom. If the cost of that is that the people at the top got much better off and that the inequality between us has grown. So I'm familiar with the argument and I just reject it. I don't think the social science evidence is on its side. I think if we take a rounded metric of well-being that includes not just wealth, but happiness, that spells that out in terms of suicide rates, obesity, child well-being, high blood pressure, and things that have to do with social stress, we see that a more equal society that is a less rich society has better well-being than a richer society that is a more unequal society. So that's my response. Thank you, Matt. It's helpful to synthesize the underlying framework for the defense of all of those policy measures. I do appreciate it. Thank you. Anybody else with a comment or a question at this point?
Please,
Go ahead. Who is that?
Flossie.
Flossie, go ahead. I can't see you, but please. Flossie, I'm having trouble hearing you. Do you have a comment?
Muted.
Are you muted, Flossie?
Muted myself.
Okay. Go ahead. I think you have to hold your space bar down for us to be able to hear you, Flossie.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, go.
I totally appreciate your dream. It's going to take a totally democratic Senate to bring any of this into. And that means whoever is talking, shut up, please.
Let's be civil, Flossie.
Yes. I don't think that we can go ahead with some of these reforms unless we have that kind of legislature. I think you're absolutely right, and that's where I'm going next. I won't get all the way to the Senate today. I'm going to focus on the presidential race. But to be clear, either the Democrats need to win a super majority in the Senate,
And so 60 votes majority, and as idealistic and optimistic as I like to be, I don't think there's a very good likelihood of that. Or else they need to win control of the Senate, and they need to eliminate the filibuster rule. And so, right, I mean, that's where we are right now. I certainly hope that if Joe Biden wins the presidency, the Democrats win modest but not super majority in the Senate, they don't let respect for arcane Senate traditions get in the way of the need to govern. And that's where I'm going next. But I do think that tremendous damage has been done to our society by Donald Trump and Republicans over the last 3+ years. But also a lot of damage has been done, frankly, by moderate Democrats over the presidencies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And so we need repair. We need ambitious legislation. Our governmental structure is designed to resist that. We don't need to make it any harder than it already is by having the filibuster in place, the filibuster rule in place, which essentially gives a small minority in the Senate who represents often a very small minority of the American population. Less than 20% of the American population, via their representation in the Senate, can block all of this legislation if the Senate doesn't reject the filibuster rule. Anyone else with a question or a comment before I get us into the convention? Go ahead.
I would just like to say that warm and fuzzy doesn't really do it. We really need to,
yeah. No, LBJ was not exactly warm and fuzzy, right? But he got a lot of legislation passed. Yeah, and by the way, it's not as if the other side has had a lot of warm and fuzzy of late either.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Okay.
All right. So let me get right into what I want to conclude with today. Anybody?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
How will the military work with these possibilities?
So Doris, are you worried that the military would be an impediment or an obstacle?
Well, a lot of our money goes to the military. So they have, quite a bit of power there. So how will the military operate?
So you may have noticed, you got some attention yesterday that for the first time in American history, national debt exceeds annual GDP, right? And that's related to two things. The first is that trillions of dollars have been spent in relief and stimulus legislation related to the coronavirus. The other thing is that the tax base has been eroded, in part through the 2017 tax reform, in part through earlier series of tax cutting legislation. As I showed you a week ago, we've seriously undermined the tax basis of the federal government by cutting taxes on the wealthiest. And then you add to that we're in the midst of a severe economic contraction that also undermines the tax base. So yes, at some point, a fair bit of what I proposed is expensive, especially something like universal basic income. Now, economists will argue that the expense tends to be long-term economically productive, right? And some economists will argue against that as well. But the idea here is, and this is particularly the case during a severe recession of the kind that we're in right now, that when the government spends, it stimulates the economy as a whole, and the result will be long-term economic growth that will increase the tax base, that will ultimately generate the revenues to pay down the debt incurred during the recession. But Doris, I think your point is well taken. If I can broaden it out, can we afford to do everything I've listed in my ambitious policy agenda and maintain our level of military spending? Can we afford to do it even if we scale back military spending by 10%? Or would we have to scale it back further than that? And I will be honest with you, I haven't run the numbers on this. I'm not trying to put together a party platform of a kind that balances the books, right? I'm trying to prompt thought and to suggest possibilities. And if it becomes politically realistic to begin doing this stuff, then we also need to think through how we finance it. I do not believe that the American military at present would be an obstacle to this reform legislation. I do believe we would have to take seriously closing some bases, demobilizing some troops, spending less on equipment, and that we would have to seriously weigh the geopolitical consequences of all of that. But as you know, the United States spends much more than the next several countries combined on military, right? Our military expenditures have, in certain respects, secured stability in the world, but they have also paralyzed our ability to maintain ourselves as a just, equitable society with decency and opportunity for all our citizens. We need to be better about balancing those two concerns. And so, Doris, it's a good question. It sets us down a path I'm not going to go down today, but it sets us down a path of thinking about how we finance all of this and how we might rebalance our priorities. It would require some of that for sure. All right. Any other questions? I did mute everyone. I'm going to unmute you for just a second, and then I'll remute you unless somebody else has something they want to ask at this juncture. All right. So let me get going again. And I wanted to do to at least get us started on, and let me see if I can find, it's funny that the way in which this is displaying. So give me a moment. For whatever reason, I'm having a hard time getting to the next slide. So let me see if the way in which I had the previous slide open is, I think, interfering with seeing the next slide. So give me just one moment, sorry. I've got a pinwheeling computer here. I think I may have to force quit. No, thank goodness. Okay. Come on. Bear with me for just one more moment. Let me see if it works now. Like I say, yes, thank goodness. Okay. The computer was not cooperating at all, but I believe I've now got it where it needs to be. I'm not seeing, but I hope you are seeing the state of the national elections at the conclusion of the Democratic nominating convention. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Okay, so let me very quickly move through a little bit of this information. If you remember, I showed you a diagram like this maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and you might notice, I believe it's exactly the same place it was when I showed it to you 3 weeks ago. And so this is my go-to source for looking at what's happening in the presidential race. This is 538.com. And what they have done here is to generate a model. And so to be clear, some of what I had showed you in the past was polls and the averages of polls. And that gives you a snapshot of where we are right now. And I can give you a little bit of that information in a moment. But this prediction, right? This is now a prediction about who will win the election. It's not just a snapshot. It's an effort to think through what's happening with the polls, but what's happening also with the economy, what's happening with the virus, what's happening with the volatility of the electorate, right? And so this model builds all of that in and suggests that at the moment, Joe Biden's chance of winning the election is higher than 2/3, almost 3/4, which means Trump's chance of winning the election is between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4, right? And so this is not by any means a slam dunk for Joe Biden, but it does suggest that unless there's a major change in the dynamics of the race right now, Biden is well positioned. And to get a sense of how this works, this is a computer model and it simulates the vote. And it actually simulates the vote 40,000 times. And so what they're saying when they say that Biden's likely victory is 73 to Trump's 27% is that 73% of the time when they run their simulations, Biden wins, right? And it's only 23% of the time that Trump wins. And as you can see here, you see the number of times Trump wins and the number of times Biden wins. And this has a lot to do with a state-by-state breakdown. In which states does Biden currently have a lead? Does it appear that all those other factors to do with the economy, the virus, the volatility of the electorate, the news, favor Biden? And as you can see, the closer to the tail of the snake in either the red side or the blue side, the stronger the support for the candidate. So Trump is running away with Wyoming and West Virginia. Biden is in a very good position in Vermont and Hawaii and Massachusetts. Where things get interesting is in the middle, right? And as you can see right now, this model favors Biden to win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota. That's what he needs, right, to win. Those are states that Donald Trump won in 2016 that were so-called blue wall states that actually went red. In addition to that, currently Biden is favored to win in Florida and Arizona. And if he wins Florida, it's very difficult to see a scenario in which Donald Trump carries the Electoral College. And by the way, I think most people believe that short of a major gaffe or collapse on the part of Joe Biden, he will win the national vote, right? The popular vote. That's not what determines the outcomes of the election. As we are all painfully aware from 2016, what determines it is who wins the Electoral College vote, and that depends on who wins the states with more Electoral College votes. And Florida, of course, is a heavy hitter in Electoral College votes. So the other thing I wanted you to notice, after they put this model together, which was just a few weeks ago, they ran it retroactively going back to June 1st. And what you can see is, I think, something that's quite important, which is the stability of Joe Biden's lead. from the beginning of June until the middle of August, right? It varies ever so slightly from the low 70s to almost 80%. Similarly, Donald Trump has dropped down to around 20 and is actually close to his high point right now in terms of his probability of victory. And so there's not a lot of volatility in the electorate right now that has something to do with polarization and something to do with the vanishing swing voter. The fact that most people have made up their minds about who to support. What really matters, it seems to me, in this election is not going to be convincing undecided voters. It's going to be mobilizing those who have already made up their minds so that they actually vote in conditions that are going to make voting more difficult, right? You're not going to be able to do it in person safely. If you try to do it in person, you may face long lines that are spread out across a huge distance in the middle of a pandemic. And so in a sense, this is also built into this model. What seems to matter most is mobilization. Now, to look at two of the states that I think are really important to the current prediction that Biden is favored to win this election, a little bit more closely, Pennsylvania, right, where Biden was born, where Trump was campaigning while Biden was getting ready to give his acceptance speech, is clearly an extremely important swing state in this election. And actually, Biden is doing a little bit better in that state than he's doing nationally, which I think is a little surprising, but also representative of some important national trends, particularly Donald Trump's declining support from suburban voters, especially suburban women. And the result of the erosion of that constituency, who mainly went for Trump in 2016, white suburban women, means that Biden has actually done better in Pennsylvania right now than he's doing nationally. Again, if this holds, that doesn't bode well for Trump. And then looking at Florida. Florida is a redder state. It's a state where most of the statewide and national representation is Republican, where voters do tend to trend a little bit Republican. And as you can see, Biden is not doing as well in Florida as he is doing nationally, but he still has about a 2/3 chance of winning Florida based on this model and these simulations. And so to just look again at the polling now for a moment, not nationally, but in Pennsylvania and Florida, I think what you can see is in part why it is that Biden's doing so well in Pennsylvania. There isn't a single poll that's a reputable poll conducted over the last few weeks that shows Biden behind in Pennsylvania. And please note that we're in a kind of polling hiatus right now. Not a lot of polls, good quality national polls, are being conducted. They're waiting for the two conventions to conclude. I don't know, we might get one or two polls coming out on Monday, but we're not going to get a lot of new data until after both conventions have concluded. Back-to-back conventions in the same 2 weeks, kind of unusual in American politics right now. Pollsters are saying, let the dust settle, and then we'll start collecting data again. When we look at Florida, what you can see is why it's closer. But again, please notice that of the good polls conducted over the last few weeks, not one of them shows Donald Trump ahead in Florida. However, two of them show Trump and Biden tied. And please note that whereas the average here is probably around 6 points leads, the average here is probably around 3. And so again, we're seeing what the race really comes down to state by state. So far, Biden doing better. I'm gonna stop there. I believe, yes, we've used the time allotted to us. I do want to again leave some time for conversation. I do want to hear, and so I'll start this portion of the conversation by asking you a question. Did you watch the convention? And if so, what did you think? I'm going to unmute everyone, and let's give those who haven't spoken yet today a chance to weigh in on that. So you are unmuted, and John Campbell's hand shot right up, like the good political science student that he is. John, start us out.
Thank you very much. We both watched the whole thing, and in fact made a point of watching it on C-SPAN so we could just see the convention per se, as opposed to all the yak from the commentators. And we were super impressed. I must say, the first thing that came to me is it was so slick. Boy, it's so good to see the Democrats to be able to do something well. You often think they screw things up, but in fact, they did it. They carried it off beautifully, and so many of those little music video sorts of things. The stuttering boy, probably outstanding, but the granddaughters, the Steph Curry and his gorgeous little kids, and the Booker emceeing all the candidates and talking back and forth, Cory Booker. And all in all, I mean, the production was great, but the content was really good too. The speeches were all good. Yeah. And there's a good piece in the Times right now about Obama's speech as a Jeremiah, which is really excellent. But I recommend that to you all. But so we came away feeling really good about it.
Yeah. So point well taken. I think many people were worried that the transition to a so-called Zoom convention, an online convention, would mean that it would become amateurish, that there would be glitches, that it wouldn't be compelling TV. And I do think that you're absolutely right, that just in terms of production values, it came off quite well. But I'll just note two other things I was going to say. One of them is ordinary people speaking from ordinary locations, I think gave a certain power to the content of the convention that you don't have when it's exclusively politicians speaking from a big floor in front of a crowd of a highly partisan audience, right? And so there was an ordinary people dimension to it that I think, in fact, definitely works to Biden's advantage as someone who claims to be an advocate for ordinary folk. Having said that, I want to note one other thing, which is that there were, and I haven't seen anybody doing this analysis, and I'm not going to do it myself, but I'm going to venture a guess that there were twice as many words spoken per hour in this convention by speakers than there were in the typical political convention. The fact that there wasn't a crowd, that there wasn't cheering, the fact that you didn't have the breaks between speakers that you typically have actually made it more efficient. And the result was that there was more diverse content and more of a sustained argument in this convention than in conventions past. We'll have to see how the Republicans do next week. Right now, we're weighing one convention against conventions past, as opposed to the two conventions against each other. Anyone else with an impression?
Michael, this is Bob.
Hi, Bob.
I read a critique yesterday, perhaps, that effectively said they did a great job of presenting themselves. Camilla was great. Biden's great. He's a compassionate, whatever. But there was very little solid content. There was no descriptions of the programs that we're going to implement. There's some promises, but no real description. What do you think of that?
I think that is mainly accurate. I think that was clearly a strategic decision, that the Democrats are trying to broaden their base. I'm not sure that's the right strategy, but that is their strategy. And that the way they've decided to do that is by signaling on issues but not getting specific on policy. And you can think of the contrast with Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, both of whom were very specific on policy in their nominating conventions. And I would say to you that I think perhaps context matters here. We are in the midst of a pandemic that has killed probably 200,000 Americans, right? We're undercounting the number of people killed. That has devastated our economy. And at the same time, we're dealing with a reckoning about racial injustice. We're also seeing, as I don't need to remind you, unprecedented wildfires in the state you're sitting in. And I should have started out saying, I hope you all are protecting your lungs, because I know that the air quality is very bad there. We're seeing a moment of, on the one hand, tremendous fractiousness in our politics when it seems like the moment requires unity, and on the other hand, tremendous incompetence that we're paying a very dear price for, right? And so in a sense, going wonkish in this moment might distract from the severity as well as the very nature of the moment we're in. That would be my response to that line of criticism. I'm not insensitive to it. It may be right, but I do think that there was a strategy behind staying at a relatively high level of focus. But please do note that there was a lot about climate change and unionization and police reform and racial justice and job creation. It didn't get down into, and here's the details of our policies, but there was a reason not to do that. Thank you, Bob. Do you want to follow up, or is that good?
Well, I wanted to say something.
No, that's fine.
All right, John, go ahead. John wants to come in again.
The other one was health policy. The other one was health policy, which was mentioned more often than the others. But the interesting thing to me was, it didn't occur to me afterwards, when we have big policy discussions in conventions, it's usually because of a fight over the platform. This convention brilliantly had no platform.
Right.
No platform committee, no platform debate. So the usual reason why we get a lot of fighting about policy, which is the last thing the Democrats wanted to do, was because they just avoided having a platform in the platform committee. I guess we won't have a platform for the election, which is fine with me.
Yeah, well, if you look at Joe Biden's website, there's a lot of policy on it. Right, and so it's not as if he's running away from policy, and frankly, that policy is quite progressive. Yeah. But I don't necessarily think that it behooved him to spend a lot of time talking about it, in part because, as I'm saying, he was trying to broaden the base. He was trying not to fight fights within the Democratic Party, but to say, we are unified and we need your help because of the crisis we're facing. All right, everybody. So another good discussion. We will continue this next week. Next week, we'll be able to really look in detail at the two conventions in comparison with each other. And then maybe we'll spend another week thinking about national politics. And then I want to start talking with you about racial justice as well.
Can I just say one thing?
Say it. Yes, please. Who is that?
I'm really looking forward to the debate between the vice presidential candidates.
Yes, I'm sure many of us are. Suzanne, are you raising your hand?
I just wonder, do you expect it to get closer after the Republican convention, or is that a question about how well they do?
Yeah, no, I don't anticipate. And I'm hesitating for a moment. We're in uncharted territory, right? We're having a national election in the middle of a pandemic in which the conferences are televised, but no longer in person, right? The conventions, and so it's hard to know what to expect. But what past precedent says is there's less and less of a bounce coming out of the convention. And we'll have to see how the Republicans do. But I'm going to suggest to you that the Republicans, in a sense, have a harder lift than the Democrats do. And for two reasons. One of them is because Donald Trump is not a gifted teleprompter speaker, right? And in a sense, the venue, the format favored Joe Biden, who was less good as a spontaneous speaker in front of a crowd, much better in front of a teleprompter. And I think he gave a very strong speech the other night. Donald Trump is going to have to up his game in a format that he has not done particularly well in the past. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that obviously the Republicans tried very hard to have a normal convention. They're still going to have something like a normal roll call vote, apparently. And I think part of the reason they're doing that is because having a virtual convention, in a sense, is the same thing as admitting that the virus is still out of control, right? That we are still forced to socially distance and not do things in the normal way that we do them, right? And so in a sense, given that the virus remains out of control while Donald Trump remains in the presidency, reflects the mismanagement of it by his administration. And it's going to be a constant backdrop to the entire Republican convention. So we'll have to see. All that to say, I don't think bounces are necessarily real. If they are, then why wouldn't Biden get one and Trump get one and they offset, given that we've got conventions going back to back? But I do think there's certain challenges the Republicans will face in having a successful convention. So you will be able to hold me to account for that prediction in exactly a week when we next get together. Thanks, everybody. Good being able to spend Saturday morning with you again. Take care. Be
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Order of